Anybody who knows anything about broadcasting will tell you that local personalities attract audiences. And yet these big companies are not investing in local personalities widely.
That's Matt Friedman, media professional and public relations expert. Radio is a format that has long captivated listeners in Metro Detroit, a region that loves its local talent. I've loved listening over the years to voices that are uniquely ours. But you're finding that less and less these days. So our feature conversation today is about the end of sports radio station WDFN, why it happened, and what's next for the station and the radio industry here as a whole.
Then we'll share a few things to know around town. I'm Jer Stays.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. This is your Daily Detroit for Wednesday, July 8th, 2020.
A quick reminder that Daily Detroit is member-supported media. Look, I hear all the time from folks who say, I should remember to become a member. Well, here's your reminder. Join us as a member at patreon.com/Daily Detroit and help keep local voices who don't have to answer to corporate overlords on the air.
I think remember to become a member should become a bumper sticker for us, Jer, and also Daily Detroit, no corporate overloads. That's another one.
I agree. And here's the thing, dailydetroit@gmail.com. Should we have jingles? Should remember to become a member become a jingle? Tell me if you guys like jingles. Let's do jingles.
Big news in commercial radio as sports talk station 1130 AM, WDFN The Fan is no more. The station changed formats to the Black Information Network, a 24-hour news service focused on issues of interest to African Americans. The station is backed by iHeartMedia, a big national radio broadcast conglomerate. WDFN launched back in 1994. It was Detroit's first dedicated 24-hour sports talk radio station. And joining us to dissect all of that and talk about what it means is Matt Friedman. He's one half of Tanner Friedman Strategic Communications and a good friend of us here at Daily Detroit. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Always happy to talk shop on Daily Detroit.
Yeah, I should mention you're also a broadcast veteran and you track the industry very closely.
I try.
Yeah.
Been tracking it from home lately, but the numbers are interesting. What interests you about this change, guys? What struck you first?
You know, it's been a long time since I listened to sports talk radio, and I used to listen to it. I think the personalities and some of the tenor drove me away, but that's sort of immaterial. You know, Detroit's obviously a huge sports town. You know, we are one of relatively few cities with, you know, teams in all four major professional sports leagues. You know, and WDFN at one time was like the big sports radio station in Detroit. It was home to some of the big pundits and sports journalists in town like Stoney and Wojo, Jamie Samuelson, Matt Derry, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so what happened to DFN? Why had it suddenly declined or whatever?
Well, there were a couple of factors, but the main factor is what happened to the corporation that owned it. So iHeartMedia is a relatively new name for a company that's been around the radio business now for quite a while called Clear Channel. They rebranded because Clear Channel became something of a bad reputation name in the broadcast business. And this all happened in January of 2009. It's important to remember the history here. And so that was really the day that the Fan wasn't the Fan anymore. They got rid of almost all of their local programming on that day. And the reason is that company got so big so fast that they couldn't pay back all of the debt that they borrowed to buy all these radio stations to become the behemoth that they became. And the local broadcaster and the local broadcast product suffered. So while we're kind of writing the obituary now for the Fan, it's actually been 11 years in the making. It happened to be, and I remember the day, it happened to be the day that Barack Obama was inaugurated as president. And there's a colleague of mine who does a lot of our media buying, and she and I were having lunch after seeing a client, and we were watching the inauguration on TV. We picked a restaurant so we could see history before our eyes, and she started getting calls and emails from people at Clear Channel saying they're getting rid of everybody. So that's how long it's been. And the other factor, in addition to corporate largesse that they couldn't keep up with, is it really became hard for sports stations around the country to be competitive if they didn't have the rights to games.
Mm.
That live programming is a must. So somebody like you, Sven, who kind of gets burned out with the chatter every day, but if you're a fan, especially if the teams are good, you're going to listen to the games.
Sure.
And they tried using the fact that they didn't air the games as a marketing advantage. You may remember a slogan that they had, the only sports station not bought and paid for by the home teams. They kind of had this rebellious kind of renegade attitude. And I think that helped them for a while. But sooner or later with that format, in order to be really successful, you have to have the games. And the only pro games that they ever really had were the Pistons on a trade deal when the Pistons were really on the downside of their run. Again, it ties in with the first point of this corporation that had trouble keeping up with its debt. If the corporate situation had been healthier, they probably would have gone out and gotten some rights for the Tigers and Wings or the Lions or maybe the Pistons under different circumstances and would have built the station around that.
Yeah, one of the things that kind of astounds me is that this is such a sports town, but frankly, the ticket has just kind of been the runaway success in the sports vertical. It just doesn't seem there's much air for anything else but them across the board. It seems like they kind of run the table right now.
Yeah, they're on FM and they have the rights to the games. So that's a great combination. I mean, the other thing, too, that plagued 1130 WDFN here and there was they did have some signal problems. There were parts of the market where you couldn't hear them real well at night, but that didn't get in the way of their success. I mean, they had a run in the 2000s where an afternoon drive, they were the number one station for men 25 to 54. That's a really coveted demographic, and they had it. And that was the Stoney and Wojo show. And it was a powerhouse radio show, one of the most successful shows of its kind in the country. And again, if they had an owner willing to invest rather than divest, we can only speculate as to what could have happened. The other thing is they've had some FM signals over the years that owner has controlled that have not been real successful. And it makes you wonder what might have happened if they had moved the sports format to FM with those personalities, if they would have been more competitive. But it's all in the rearview mirror now. I mean, what they've been running the last several years is almost all nationally or statewide syndicated programming coming from their co-owned stations in other markets or in different areas of the state. The exception to that has been Matt Shepard, was doing a very credible morning interview show. But when he became the Tigers play-by-play voice on TV, that went away, and there just wasn't a lot for them to hang their hat on anymore.
I was going to say that trend of centralized broadcasting and running syndicated programming is not unique to AM, and it's not even really unique to talk radio, right? I mean, like FM stations that play music are often computer generated and broadcast centrally out of Wichita for multiple markets or whatever, right?
Yeah, we see that. I mean, the Clear Channel, now iHeart, was really the pioneer in what's known as voice tracking. So rather than have a DJ host a music show in Detroit, for example, they'll pay somebody in another market $50 to track the show. In other words, it's to record their voice and mix it with music on a computer and basically upload an FTP audio file, and that becomes the show. They were really the pioneers in that. By no means are they the only ones doing it. And they, in some of their newer rounds of cuts in the last year, have talked about innovation like artificial intelligence. So they're going away from the local personality and more toward content sharing. And I understand how that might help them pay down some debt, but it's really hard to see how that's going to attract new audiences, especially in a place like Detroit, where we like our local voices and we like our personalities. And, a show like yours can really connect with the community because the two of you are of the community, and listeners know that.
Yeah, I mean, if these national groups just want to keep, doing only national programming, I'm just going to go ahead and let them do that and then just pick up the table. Because, I mean, it's amazing to me when in this world of on-demand and personalization that you've got these companies that are going for even more of the mass market. But I think my next question is kind of in two parts, and I'll lay down the first one to set up the second. AM versus FM. It really seems like AM is just not as relevant as it once was. I mean, you've got a few flagships out there, and I think about like WWJ and WJR. But outside of that, it just seems like AM is slowly fading into the sunset. But I don't know if that's true. It feels that way. It feels like I'm very rarely on the AM side of the dial.
Here in Detroit, we have more relevant AM programming than almost any other market. In fact, I've set up clients and people from outside the market to go on radio shows here to be interviewed by radio here, and they were like, "Really? AM?" We have two powerhouses in WWJ and WJR, and that's unusual nationally to have that sort of. I mean, if you look at our top rated stations in the market, if you look at the most recent ratings, WWJ is the second highest rated station in the market, AM only.
Mm-hmm.
Their equivalent station, Entercom's equivalent station, sister station, if you will, in Chicago is simulcast on AM and FM. So Detroit is a little bit behind the trend, but you're right. I mean, FM radio sounds better. They don't have the signal issues. When you're driving around in your car, it's one less button to press. And, for younger audiences, I don't even know if they know what AM is. I worry sometimes as a former radio guy, they don't know what FM is, but that's a whole other conversation. But I think, in Detroit, we have some culturally ingrained properties. I mean, you look at WWJ turning 100 years old this year, WJR not far behind them.
Mm-hmm.
That's real tradition. And if you grew up listening to it, or you grew up with your parents, your grandparents listening to it, you at least know what it is. That's not the case in every market.
Well, and they do a lot of local programming. I think that's the other thing people forget. Like JR, whether or not, a lot of their lineup is pretty conservative, but also a lot of it is pretty darn local, which is good to see. And then also on WWJ, they're just constantly doing news and traffic, but a lot of that is, local content.
Oh, almost all of it is. Makes a huge difference. And so back to what we were talking about with 1130 and that signal, that was DFN. I guess they'll probably still use the call letters, at least for now. If you notice, their announcement has been, it's the Black Information Network,
Mm-hmm.
emphasis on network. And I don't see, at least initially, anything about local programming.
Right.
And I wouldn't be surprised if there isn't any right away. Now, it may help fill a void. I crunched some of the numbers from Nielsen yesterday, and according to Nielsen, 22% of the radio audience in this market is Black. And I think it would be hard to argue that 22% of the radio programming appeals to that community.
Oh, it definitely doesn't. I mean, we need a lot more voices of color on the air and in mainstream areas, especially with radio. And I think about I asked the AM question in part because when I hear about the Black Information Network, I started digging around. I was like, this is in the same zone as like 910 AM, which also prides itself as being a voice of the community in that kind of way, but they really haven't made that huge strides in the ratings game.
No, they haven't. They haven't had a lot of consistency on the air, which has been a challenge for them. It's hard to know who the players are without a scorecard, but they're trying to do something different, and they have attracted an audience. And the question is, if you agree that there's room for more voices, and I do, who are the voices going to be? I think that it would be much better if it were local voices. There are some terrific local voices that aren't being heard right now that have a lot to say and a lot to listen to. And ideally, a station like this would employ them. But that's a pretty tall order in today's corporate media environment to expect that they would actually pay somebody to be on the radio locally. That's a lot to ask.
Really?
And that's unfortunate.
You really look at that as something where it's a function of finances. Because one of the things I keep hearing from media critics and the like is, well, you've got all of these different, more mainstream voices or voices you've always listened to. And then, well, why don't they add more people of color and things like that? And one of the things I keep hearing is that, well, there's just the economics don't work to hire anybody. But I'm not an expert. I don't know if that's necessarily true. It seems like you have more insight in that than I do.
I haven't seen their books, okay? But what I do know is that anybody who knows anything about broadcasting will tell you that local personalities attract audiences. And yet these big companies are not investing in local personalities widely. So why is that? Well, when you look at a company like iHeart, which still owes, a tremendous amount of money in debt, and their at least most visible equity owner is Bain Capital. And we all remember Bain Capital from the Mitt Romney campaign.
Yes, we do.
And we know about private equity and how that works. It's all about trying to maximize as much money to send to those people as possible and not necessarily to pay people here locally to host radio programs. And so I just want to temper expectations that while there may be a Black-oriented network on the air here in Detroit, and that helps fill a void, expect to hear national voices, either primarily or very likely exclusively. And so it fills part of the void, but doesn't fill all the void. And again, as somebody who really likes and appreciates and started in the medium, that's a shame.
Matt, does this tell us anything about the future of commercial radio and talk radio in general?
I think it's a symptom of something that's been around for a long time. Like I said, this really came to light in 2009. And if you want to go back even further than that, the seeds of this were planted in 1996 when a federal law was passed and signed by President Bill Clinton, which basically allowed broadcasting companies to own as many stations as they wanted, and bigger became the imperative.
Right.
And that was the first domino to fall. And, here we are in 2020, having some of the same conversations we were having before. The trends are not positive in local terrestrial radio. And I think everybody who's a fan of the medium is rooting to hang on to the status quo as long as possible, because it's really hard to envision any sort of local personality and talent expansion. But that's where podcasts come in. That's where satellite, while it's not local, has a lot of quality. That's where that might come in. That's where public radio comes in, which is doing pretty well. I looked at the current ratings in this market, and public radio is holding its own in terms of audience. The ratings, by the way, have been a little weird the last few months because we don't have drive time
Right.
the way that we normally would. And the fear was that nobody was going to be listening to the radio because nobody was going to be in the car during drive times. And those fears were exaggerated. The audience has shifted a little bit in some cases from format to format. Sports radio doesn't quite have the audience it did a few months ago. Understandable. Sports aren't being played.
Not much to talk about.
I mean, if you listen to the Valenti show now, it's a completely different show on the ticket, and it's more about what's happening in the world because there's literally nothing to talk about in the sports world.
Yeah. I mean, in news radio, WWJ seems to be holding their own, and some of the music stations are. And by the way, listenership and ratings is a very inexact science in radio. For those who don't know, it's based on a device called a portable people meter. It's about the size of a pager. If you remember having a pager, and you're supposed to keep it on your person at all times, in a pocket or in a purse or on a desktop, and that measures what you're listening to. And some people won't carry them. Some people carry them because they want to participate in the survey. But basically, the ratings are what the portable people meter picks up. And so it's inexact, but sometimes you look at it and common sense tells you that in cases like this, it's probably right. Not surprising, more people are listening to news and fewer people are listening to other formats.
Well, and it kind of gives you an idea of trends, As far as an exact science, I mean, I used to work in broadcast TV, and we all used to joke that it's kind of a group hallucination we all agreed to, So, like, we know that people are listening. We know the trends. It isn't an exact science, and it's based on sampling. And I can share from our experience. I mean, our listenership, a lot of people worried about podcasts in general, and maybe there are some areas that podcasts have declined. But for us, listenership is way up throughout the pandemic. We've never seen numbers like this before. And it's frankly was kind of surprising. The other thing we saw is that with digital downloads, we know kind of when people are listening to shows, kind of like when people are downloading. And we see an idea that it's definitely flattened out, where it used to be big spikes in the morning and the afternoon. They're still there, but things have kind of flattened out through the day where people kind of consume it as they, have time.
And here's what's not going to happen. You're not going to one day wake up and be told, sorry, guys, we're going to get a couple of people from Dallas to do a daily Detroit podcast. That's not going to happen.
No, it's not.
But in commercial terrestrial radio, that's been happening for a long time. I mean, the format changes have always happened since the dawn of the medium. But the way that technology is being exploited now by these corporate owners means that there's a lot of looking over their shoulder. It's like one person in media has told me, I think the radio people will relate to this, every day they show up and the key card still works and they feel good because they can actually get into the building.
Wow.
And that's a really tough way to live. But when you listen to these people on the radio, that's to some extent, that's what they face. And for those who really connect with them as personalities, it's hard to imagine that a corporate accountant would see it differently.
Yeah. Brutal business.
Oh, for sure. Matt, I guess I'll kind of wrap this up with, what would you do to win in this kind of situation? Because it feels like these format changes, they're constant. I mean, they've always been in radio, but it's something where across the country you're seeing kind of the same patterns over and over again. I mean, it's a large number of cities that this Black Information Network is going out. And I kind of thought it would be something where maybe there's some centralized national news and then some local voices. But as you're sharing, a lot of it's going to be national.
Educated guess. Yeah.
Yeah. What would you do to kind of win and rethink it to kind of, give radio another renaissance?
It's easy for me to say this because it's other people's money I'm talking about, but I would think in a market like Detroit, I talked about that 22% Black audience estimate by Nielsen, underserved, that you get some compelling personalities local to augment the national programming and sell it multi-platform. In other words, listen to us on the radio, listen to our podcast, stream us, and really empower the listener to connect with the personality in the ways that make sense for them. I would think that would be a moneymaker. It would require some upfront cost, of course, in talent fees or maybe some salaries, and it would have to be well produced and really attentive to the audience. But I think it would be a winner, especially if some consistency could be established. There's some known quantities in this market. Like I say, there's some real talent, some people who could host shows and really deliver an audience if only given the opportunity. So I'd love to see that, but I'm pessimistic that something like that would happen because these corporations, if they're going to order a company-wide format flip to accommodate a network, that's code for we're going to make this as low cost as we possibly can.
Mm. Matt Friedman is half of the Tanner Friedman Strategic Communications public relations firm. Matt, thanks so much. As always, always enjoy having you on.
Thank you. Always enjoy being on.
Before we let you go, here are a few things to know around Metro Detroit.
We, have a phased-in re-engagement of our economy, and I had hoped to take the rest of the state into phase 5, but we dialed it back right before 4th of July because we see these numbers increasing. So not having bars that are serving indoors, that's one thing. But, we're going to continue to monitor the numbers. If they keep moving up, we're going to dial back if we have to. And it's the last thing any of us wants. I got to tell you, I want to re-engage this economy more than anyone, but I'm not going to do it if it is too risky to do so. And that's why we're staying focused on the epidemiology. I'm not going to be bullied into moving before it's safe. And if we have to move back, we're going to.
That's Governor Gretchen Whitmer on CNN on Tuesday, talking about the gradual uptick in COVID-19 cases in Michigan. The state reported 454 new coronavirus cases on Tuesday, with 30 deaths. Most of those new deaths are due to a record update, but even with that, it's still an increase. We now have more than 66,600 cases and 6,000 deaths in Michigan. The state's effective spread rate is down to 1.18. That's 18th highest in the nation. But key here is the virus will continue to grow until we can get that rate below an RT level of 1.
Meanwhile, the Associated Press reports that a trade group representing the nation's biggest retailers, like Walmart, Target, and Home Depot, is urging state governors to require people to wear face masks in public and while shopping in stores. The Retail Industry Leaders Association told the National Governors Association that different rules around the country are leading to confrontations between angry shoppers and employees who are trying to enforce store rules. Fewer than half of states require masks to be worn in public, the group says. In an exclusive story you're hearing first here on Daily Detroit, Chipotle is planning to open a new location in Ferndale. A spokeswoman tells me that the fast casual Mexican eatery plans to open this fall at 23123 Woodward Avenue. That's the former site of Dickey's barbecue pit, which recently closed. This will be Chipotle's first store in Ferndale. And a shout out to our own eagle-eyed producer, Cheyenne Nosarini, for spotting this. We have a blog post up all about it on dailydetroit.com.
So, Sven, that's just north of 9 Mile on Woodward there. Are you going to miss Dickey's?
I'm going to be eating good in the neighborhood, Jer.
You're looking forward to the Chipotle, huh?
Yeah, I like Chipotle for sure.
From Ferndale up to Sterling Heights. Sven, are you ready for a road trip to the Golden Corridor?
Not really.
Well, that's what Portillo's is saying in their press materials as the popular Chicago-based hot dog and sandwich chain is coming to Metro Detroit. They're doing their first garage-style concept in Sterling Heights off of Hall Road near Hayes and Shaner. Portillo's, if you haven't been to Chicago, serves, well, the Chicago-style hot dog, Italian beef sandwiches, burgers, and chocolate cake. I can speak to the Italian beef, but I have my questions about cake.
Yeah, don't eat all those things at once. You're going to give yourself a horrible stomachache.
This isn't the first time a Chicago staple has made a run at Detroit. Recently, there was a Giordano's deep dish pizzeria in downtown Detroit that closed after a short-lived stint near Greektown. The restaurant will be nearly 8,000 square feet, seat more than 180 people inside, and have a patio for an additional 50 diners. In true Golden Corridor car-centric fashion, it'll also have a double drive-through, folks. It'll be ready in the second half of next year.
Definitely good to be able to report a couple of restaurants opening as opposed to closing for a change.
And that's all for today. Thanks so much for listening, and be sure to tell a friend about the podcast. I'm Jer Staggs.
And I'm Sven Gustafson. Take care of each other, and we'll get through this together.